Tutankhamun did not inherit a golden age. He was born into a collapsing one. Before the gold mask, before the treasure, before the legends that would one day turn him into the most famous corpse in human history, there was a frightened child born into chaos. A child whose name would later echo across museums and textbooks, but whose life, in truth, was quiet, fragile, and dangerously short. To understand Tutankhamun, you must first understand the world that was already breaking when he opened his eyes. 18th dynasty Egypt was supposed to be invincible. For generations, the Nile flowed on schedule, the temples overflowed with offerings, and the gods, especially Amun, stood at the center of both religion and power. Then came Akhenaten. Tutankhamun's father, or very likely his father, was not merely a pharaoh. He was a revolutionary, and revolutions are rarely kind to children. Akhenaten shattered the old order by doing something unthinkable. He rejected Egypt's gods. Amun, Ra, Osiris, all sidelined in favor of a single solar disk, the Aten. Temples were closed. Priests were stripped of power. Centuries of tradition were erased almost overnight. The capital was abandoned. A new city, Akhetaten, rose from the desert, beautiful, fragile, and hated. Egypt did not collapse immediately. It rotted slowly. Tutankhamun was born around 1341 BCE, likely inside this experimental city. His original name was Tutankhaten, the living image of Aten. Even his name was a political statement before he could speak. His mother remains uncertain, possibly Ankhesenaten, possibly a secondary wife, possibly even a close blood relative, something disturbingly common in royal Egypt. What is clear is this: Tutankhamun's body already carried the consequences of generations of incest. Modern examinations show deformities, a weakened immune system, a body that was never built for war, rule, or long survival. He was not born to be strong. He was born to be useful. By the time Tutankhamun was a toddler, Akhenaten's religious experiment was failing. Foreign territories were slipping away. Letters from desperate vassals went unanswered. Egypt's enemies were watching. Inside the palace, resentment grew. Priests wanted revenge. Military leaders wanted order. Courtiers wanted survival. And somewhere in the middle of this tension stood a small boy, royal blood, weak body, empty throne waiting. Akhenaten died around year 17 of his reign. The transition was messy, possibly violent, and poorly recorded, which in Egypt usually means deliberately erased. Tutankhamun was about 8 or 9 years old when he became king, a child ruler in a kingdom that had lost faith in its own gods. Tutankhamun never ruled alone. From the first day of his reign, power rested elsewhere, in the hands of men who would shape his fate quietly and efficiently. I, the royal advisor, priest, and master survivor, Horemheb, the general, soldier, and future king. They did not need Tutankhamun to rule. They needed him to legitimize their decisions. Under their guidance, the boy king's name was changed. Tutankhaten became Tutankhamun, the living image of Amun. The old gods were restored, the temples reopened, the priests returned. Officially, Egypt was healed. Unofficially, Tutankhamun was a symbol, not a sovereign. Paintings show Tutankhamun as a traditional pharaoh, tall, powerful, victorious, but reality was far less heroic. He walked with difficulty. He likely relied on canes. Dozens were found in his tomb. His health was fragile, his movements limited. And yet, the machinery of kingship rolled forward. He married young, Ankhesenamun, his half-sister. He appeared in ceremonies. He smiled for eternity in stone reliefs. But behind the walls of the palace, decisions were made without him. And somewhere, time was running out. Tutankhamun ruled for roughly 9 years. No great wars, no monumental temples, no grand speeches remembered. Then, suddenly, he was dead. No announcement, no dramatic inscription, no heroic explanation. Just a burial rushed beyond tradition in a tomb that may not have been meant for him at all. The boy king vanished, and Egypt moved on. Or so it thought.
Tutankhamun did not ascend a throne of confidence or stability. He inherited something far more dangerous, a throne built on compromise, fear, and unfinished revenge. When the boy became king, Egypt was pretending to heal, but beneath the surface, nothing was settled. The old gods had returned, yes, but the wounds left by Akhenaten's revolution were still open, still infected, and everyone at court knew it. Tutankhamun was crowned at an age when most children are still learning discipline, not diplomacy. He could not read political intent. He could not recognize enemies disguised as allies. He could barely understand the forces pulling his kingdom apart, which made him perfect. A child king is not chosen for his wisdom. He is chosen because he can be guided or ignored. From the earliest days of his reign, Tutankhamun's decrees bore language far too sophisticated for a boy. His policies reversed an entire religious system with astonishing speed. His proclamations spoke of divine restoration and national unity. These were not the words of a child. They were the words of men standing behind him. I had survived everything. He served under Akhenaten. He adapted when the old gods returned. He watched rulers rise and fall without ever stepping into the spotlight too early. I understood something crucial. Power does not always require a crown. As God's father and chief advisor, I was positioned close enough to guide the king and patient enough to outlive him. He likely arranged Tutankhamun's marriage. He influenced religious decrees. He controlled access. To the boy king, I was mentor and protector. To Egypt, he was continuity. To history, he was opportunity waiting. Where I was subtle, Horemheb was direct. A military commander shaped by discipline and order, Horemheb saw Akhenaten's reign as weakness incarnate. To him, religion was not philosophy, it was stability. He did not need Tutankhamun to believe, he needed him to sign. Under Horemheb, the army regained status, borders were reinforced, Egypt's posture hardened. But Horemheb was not patient like I. He was ambitious, and ambition rarely tolerates delay. Two powerful men, one fragile king. This balance could never last. Ankhesenamun, Tutankhamun's wife, was young but not blind. She had lived through her father Akhenaten's fall. She had watched her family erased from official memory. She knew how quickly royal blood could become a liability. Her marriage was political, her position was ceremonial, her future was uncertain. In art, she stands beside Tutankhamun as an equal. In reality, she stood between two predators. Official records claim Tutankhamun restored order. Temples reopened, Amun's priests returned, festivals resumed. But restoration was also performance. The capital quietly moved away from Akhetaten. The heretic city was abandoned to sand.
Akhenaten's name was systematically erased. Tutankhamun's reign became a bridge, a convenient pause between disgrace and renewed authority. The boy king was not remembered as a radical, he was remembered as a correction. While the kingdom performed stability, Tutankhamun's body betrayed him. He suffered frequent illness. Walking caused pain. Infections lingered. Canes filled his tomb not as symbols, but as necessities. Each year he ruled was a year borrowed, and everyone around him knew it. Kings were supposed to be divine, untouchable, eternal. Tutankhamun was none of these. He relied on others to move him, to decide for him, to protect him. But protection is fragile when succession is unclear and power is concentrated behind the throne instead of on it. By his late teens, Tutankhamun had produced no surviving heir. This was not just tragic, it was dangerous. In a court filled with ambition, silence is louder than accusation. No records describe concern for the king's health. No inscriptions mourn a slow decline. No documents prepare the kingdom for loss. And when death finally came, it came fast. Too fast. Power in ancient Egypt did not always announce itself with crowns or ceremony. Sometimes it moved quietly, through corridors, marriages, sealed rooms, and decisions made while a king slept. Tutankhamun ruled Egypt in name, but Egypt was ruled by momentum, and momentum favored adults, not children. From the moment he was crowned, the machinery of the state resumed its old habits. Officials returned to their offices, priests reclaimed their rituals, generals resumed their drills. None of this required the king's input, all of it required his approval, and approval was easy to obtain. Tutankhamun's daily life was tightly controlled. Who he saw, when he appeared, what messages reached him, nothing was left to chance. This was not cruelty, it was efficiency. A young king surrounded by chaos was dangerous. A young king shielded from it was useful. I stood closest. He was old enough to remember Egypt before Akhenaten. He had learned how to survive religious collapse without choosing sides too openly. He spoke softly, deferred publicly, and never rushed. I's genius was patience. He did not need to overthrow Tutankhamun. He only needed to remain indispensable. Every ceremony passed through him. Every petition flowed across his desk. When the king spoke, I had already shaped the words. To the court, I was stability incarnate. To the priests, he was a bridge back to power. To the young king, he was safety. And safety creates dependency. Horemheb, by contrast, did not linger in shadows. He was visible, decorated, respected. Soldiers trusted him. Foreign powers feared him. Where I whispered continuity, Horemheb promised strength. Egypt had lost territory during Akhenaten's reign. Alliances had weakened. Tribute had slowed. To a military man, this was unacceptable. Horemheb believed Egypt needed discipline, not philosophy, order, not theology, and he believed order came from command, not compromise. Tutankhamun was too young to challenge either vision, so he did what many young rulers do when surrounded by stronger personalities. He listened. The court functioned as a balance, a fragile one. I handled religion and administration. Horemheb handled the army. Tutankhamun stood between them, a living seal placed on documents that mattered more than he did. This arrangement worked only as long as the king lived, and everyone understood that his health was uncertain. His body, already weakened by inherited conditions, struggled under the physical demands of kingship. Long ceremonies exhausted him. Travel caused pain. Minor injuries became serious. Every illness raised an unspoken question: what happens next? Succession in ancient Egypt was never purely biological, it was political. A weak or childless king invited competition, and Tutankhamun was both weak and childless. Ankhesenamun knew this. She had lost her father, her city, and her religion before she reached adulthood. She understood that royal women were not protected by blood alone. They were protected by relevance. Without an heir, her relevance was fading. The silence surrounding her role is telling. No inscriptions celebrate her influence. No monuments elevate her authority. She appears beside the king, but never beyond him. She was visible, but powerless. As Tutankhamun aged into his late teens, the court's patience thinned. Not openly, not violently, but quietly calculations began to shift. I was old, time was not on his side. Horemheb was strong, time favored him. Tutankhamun was fragile, time was against him. Then, suddenly, time ran out. The king died around the age of 19. There was no gradual transition, no long period of mourning described in records, no clear cause of death announced, just absence. His burial was rushed, the tomb was small, the grave goods, though rich, appear assembled quickly, some items clearly made for someone else. This was not how Egypt buried a long-reigning, powerful king. This was how Egypt buried a problem, efficiently, quietly, and without questions. I performed the burial rites. This alone is significant. The man who wrapped the king for eternity was the man who benefited most from his death. Shortly after, I took the throne. Horemheb waited. The boy king disappeared into stone and sand, his name destined to fade like so many others. For over 3,000 years, it worked. No one asked how Tutankhamun died. No one questioned the speed. No one disturbed the silence, until the tomb was opened, and the silence broke.
Tutankhamun did not die as kings were meant to die. There were no records of a long illness, no public preparations, no gradual fading marked by ritual texts or priestly observations. His death arrived abruptly, and Egypt responded with speed, not ceremony. For a civilization obsessed with death, this is telling.
History prefers clean endings. Murder complicates legacies, destabilizes narratives, and forces uncomfortable questions. For centuries, Tutankhamun's death was treated as an unfortunate mystery, tragic but ultimately irrelevant. That changed the moment his body was unsealed. The modern world expected gold. What it found instead was evidence. Not proof in the legal sense, not a signed confession or a named killer, but something more unsettling, a convergence of motives, opportunities, and silences that refuse to align with accident alone. Tutankhamun's death was not investigated by his own people, it was managed. Ancient Egypt recorded everything that mattered. Victories were carved into stone. Religious reforms were immortalized in reliefs. Even failures were reframed as divine tests. But Tutankhamun's final days are blank. No medical papyri, no priestly accounts, no mourning texts describing decline or disease. This absence is the first clue. When a king died naturally, especially a young one, Egypt explained why. To preserve cosmic order, death had to make sense. Illness could be blamed on the gods. Injury could be reframed as fate. Silence suggests something else. Modern forensic examinations revealed a body under stress long before death. Genetic analysis confirmed severe hereditary conditions. His immune system was weak, his bones fragile. He was vulnerable, and vulnerability attracts intervention. The leg fracture stands at the center of the debate. The injury occurred shortly before death, not years, not months. It was severe enough to immobilize him. Infections in ancient Egypt were often fatal, even for the healthy. But fractures do not appear spontaneously. How did a king, already physically limited, break his leg so badly? Some argue for an accident, a fall perhaps from a chariot. But Tutankhamun was not a skilled charioteer. His deformities made such activity dangerous. Depictions of him hunting and riding are symbolic, not documentary. Others suggest deliberate harm, a push, a staged accident, a moment of force disguised as misfortune. No one heard the king cry out. No record mentions the injury. No time was given for recovery. Instead, death followed swiftly, and then came the burial. Every step afterward favors the interpretation of urgency over grief. The embalmers rushed. The tomb was repurposed. The funerary goods were adapted rather than commissioned. I did not wait. He took the throne with ritual precision, performing rites normally reserved for heirs. He married the widow, not as a gesture of continuity, but of control. This matters. In ancient Egypt, legitimacy flowed through blood and ritual. By marrying Tutankhamun, I closed the line of questioning before it could open. He transformed himself from advisor to rightful king in a single act. And yet, his reign was short, almost defensive. Horemheb, meanwhile, erased both I and Tutankhamun from official king lists once he gained power. Their reigns were treated as interruptions, mistakes to be corrected. This erasure is the second clue. If Tutankhamun had died innocently, his memory would have been useful. He represented restoration, divine favor, stability. Instead, he was quietly removed from history by the man who followed. Erasure is not indifference, it is intent. Still, doubt remains. Science does not conclusively prove murder. Disease, infection, and genetic weakness could explain everything. But history does not operate on certainty alone. It operates on probability. And the probability that a weak, isolated teenage king died naturally at the exact moment his death benefited every powerful figure around him is difficult to accept. Tutankhamun's greatest crime may not have been heresy or failure. It may have been survival, just long enough to become inconvenient. The truth is likely this: he was not assassinated with ceremony, he was removed with efficiency. No witnesses, no accusations, no legacy allowed. Only gold, silence, and a sealed door. Until that door was opened.
For more than 3,000 years, Tutankhamun remained exactly where those around him had intended him to stay, forgotten. Egypt remembered conquerors, builders, reformers. Tutankhamun was none of these. His name vanished from king lists. His monuments were reused or dismantled. His reign was treated as a brief correction between stronger hands. If not for chance, he would have remained a footnote, another fragile ruler erased by time. Chance, however, has a way of disrupting carefully constructed silence. In November 1922, in the Valley of the Kings, a step emerged from the sand. Howard Carter had been searching for years. Funds were running low, patience was exhausted. The valley had been picked clean by generations of tomb robbers and archaeologists who believed nothing significant remained. Tutankhamun was not supposed to be there. When Carter finally breached the sealed doorway and peered inside by candlelight, he did not see a modest burial. He did not see emptiness. He saw gold. Beds shaped like sacred animals. Chariots stacked dismantled but intact. Statues standing as if on guard. And beyond them, a sealed chamber that no one had opened since the Bronze Age. The discovery shocked the world, not because Tutankhamun was important, but because his tomb was untouched. Other kings were looted within decades, some within days. Tutankhamun, buried hastily and forgotten quickly, had been spared precisely because he was insignificant. Obscurity became preservation. As the tomb was slowly emptied and documented, a strange contradiction emerged. The burial was rushed, yet the wealth was extraordinary. The tomb was small, yet it contained over 5,000 objects. This was not the burial of a beloved ruler. It was the burial of a symbol. The gold mask became iconic almost immediately, serene, perfect, timeless. It presented Tutankhamun not as he was, but as Egypt wanted kings to appear, eternal, flawless, divine. The real body told another story. When the mummy was finally examined, it was damaged, fragile, and incomplete. Bones were brittle. The chest collapsed. The body had been roughly handled, both in antiquity and during early examinations. Tutankhamun, in death, was treated much like he had been in life, as an object to be managed. The discovery triggered global obsession. Newspapers framed him as a mysterious boy king. Exhibitions turned him into spectacle. The so-called curse of the tomb added drama, fear, and myth. But myths are convenient distractions. They keep attention away from quieter questions. Why was his tomb so small? Why were items repurposed? Why did his burial lack preparation? Why was his death never explained? The more scholars studied the tomb, the clearer it became that Tutankhamun's afterlife was improvised. Even the coffin tells the story. The innermost coffin was solid gold, astonishingly valuable, but the outer arrangements show signs of adaptation. Names were altered, symbols were reworked.
time was missing. This was not the resting place of a king whose death had been anticipated. It was the resting place of a king whose death interrupted plans. Ironically, the discovery restored what ancient Egypt tried to erase. Tutankhamun became the most famous pharaoh on earth, not for what he did, but for what was done to him. The silence failed. The boy king spoke again, not through words, but through artifacts, fractures, and unanswered questions. And the world listened.
Tutankhamun's fame is a modern invention. In life, he was a minor king. In death, he was nearly erased. In discovery, he became immortal. But immortality came at a cost: truth. The world did not fall in love with Tutankhamun, the human being. It fell in love with Tutankhamun, the image, the gold mask, the treasures, the illusion of perfection frozen in time. Gold is persuasive. It tells a story people want to believe. Museums framed him as a symbol of ancient splendor. Media called him the boy king, as if youth itself explained everything. His weaknesses were softened, his political insignificance ignored, his suffering aestheticized. Tutankhamun became beautiful, and beauty, when repeated often enough, becomes a lie. The mask does not show pain. It does not show deformity. It does not show fear. It shows a king who never existed. This was not deception by ancient Egyptians alone. It was continued eagerly by the modern world. Scholars debated timelines and artifacts, but the public absorbed myth. Gold drowned out nuance. The narrative was simple: a young king, a tragic death, a magnificent tomb. Simple stories travel farther than complicated truths. What was lost was context. Tutankhamun did not rule during a golden age. He ruled during repair. His reign was defined by reversal, not vision. His policies were restorations designed by others. His image was constructed to reassure a traumatized society. He was not a hero. He was a placeholder. And yet the myth required him to be more. Exhibitions toured the world. Crowds lined up for hours to glimpse objects that once surrounded a forgotten teenager. His name became synonymous with ancient Egypt itself, eclipsing rulers who built empires, commanded armies, and reshaped history. Tutankhamun's greatest power came after death. This irony is uncomfortable, because when myth replaces reality, suffering becomes decoration. His physical pain becomes trivia. His political manipulation becomes footnote. His possible murder becomes speculation, interesting but optional. The lie is not that Tutankhamun was important. The lie is that he was powerful. Power belonged to those around him, to men who survived him, to systems that consumed him and moved on. Gold does not testify in court. Masks do not accuse. Treasures do not explain silence. They distract, and distraction was always the safest way to bury a truth that could not be spoken aloud. Tutankhamun's legacy, as the world knows it, is therefore incomplete, not false, but curated, polished, made comfortable. The real story is quieter: a boy born into collapse, used to stabilize a broken kingdom, removed when no longer necessary, remembered only because chance refused to cooperate with erasure. In stripping away the myth, what remains is not a legend, but a warning. History does not remember the powerless accurately. It remembers them beautifully. For centuries, Tutankhamun lay exactly as intended: sealed, silent, irrelevant. But history is not static. It waits.
When modern science returned to his body, it did not come seeking myth, it came seeking explanation. And what it found did not restore the legend, it dismantled it. DNA analysis confirmed what had long been suspected. Tutankhamun was the product of close royal incest. His parents were almost certainly siblings. His body bore the consequences: fragile bones, compromised immunity, developmental abnormalities. This was not the body of a warrior king. It was the body of a child born into obligation. CT scans revealed more: bone necrosis in the foot, structural deformities, evidence of chronic pain. Walking was difficult. Standing for long periods may have been impossible. The canes in his tomb were not ceremonial, they were necessary. Tutankhamun lived in discomfort long before he died. Science did not give him strength, it gave him context. The romantic image of a vibrant boy king faded. In its place stood a vulnerable teenager navigating a court that had no patience for weakness, a king whose divinity was symbolic, not physical, a ruler whose body could not support the role imposed on him. And yet, this fragility did not erase him, it amplified him, because for the first time, Tutankhamun was no longer just gold, he was human. Science also forced scholars to confront the political aftermath of his death. Succession was not natural, it was engineered. Ai's rapid rise, his strategic marriage, Horemheb's later erasure of the entire period. These were not the actions of men honoring a fallen king. They were the actions of men closing a chapter. Modern Egyptology no longer speaks in absolutes. Murder cannot be proven. Accident cannot be ruled out. Disease remains a possibility. But certainty was never the point. Meaning was. Tutankhamun's story matters not because he was great, but because he was used. His reign reveals how power behaves when it wears ritual as camouflage, how systems preserve themselves at the expense of individuals, how children, even crowned ones, are not spared when stability is at stake. In life, he was controlled. In death, he was erased. In discovery, he was transformed. And now, finally, he is understood. The boy king did not change Egypt. Egypt changed him, shaped him, consumed him, and buried him quickly enough to avoid questions. But questions survived. They survived in fractures, in altered inscriptions, in rushed rituals, in silence where explanation should have been. Tutankhamun did not speak in proclamations or victories. He spoke through absence, and absence, when examined closely, is loud. His final legacy is not the mask. It is the reminder that history often preserves beauty better than truth, and that sometimes the smallest reigns expose the largest lies. 3,000 years later, the boy king they tried to forget became impossible to ignore, not because he ruled, but because he endured.